Chapter 14 of Almond-Blossom. This Librivox Recording is in the public domain. Almond-Blossom by Wadsley. Chapter 14. Il vaut mieux se taire que de dire hors du temps des choses tendres. Stendhal. Change would be a good thing, Tony said. What do you think, G? I thought so nearly 3 years ago, G returned vigorously, and was told that Doro refused to entertain the idea. Naturally she would do so, it being for her good, and she young enough to know worse, as again I pointed out at the time. Well, it's got to be now, Tony announced gloomily. Place is like a morgue. Pembroke gone, Rex away, the child and I alone. When she's not hunting, she's practising, and when she's doing neither, she's silent. He himself sat in silence for a moment. Then he burst out, "Damn Pasquale!" Yes, but less loudly. A quiet damn is equally efficacious. Tony slewed round his face and stared at her intently. Gee, do you think she cares still? G gave a little sigh. Her restless fingers, slender and straight still, loaded with rings, went on tapping the top of her ebony stick. "Youth is so unjudgeable," she said at length. "You ask me if Doro still cares for Pan? My dear, I think yes, but not, of course, as she did. That at her age would be impossible. Not even 18 to 20 can live at fever heat, but just because of those 18 to 20 years, she does still. But he's not Pan now. He is an altar, I suspect, where no flowers bloom. A memory with a flame behind it, shining through and obscuring the real vision from the devotee. Youth never remembers, but it also never forgets. There is a difference, you know. Youth manages so ably to discard any memory it does not care for, whilst clinging with devilish obstinacy to the main fact. Youth concentrates so mistakenly, and believes in never and ever as if they were truth, and not a sentimental paradox. So give her change, my dear, let her rip. She's lovely, lovable, and alive. She'll do it all right. We have been fools to trust to the help of time. Time seldom does much for any real lovers, save make 'em pleased with themselves for being faithful. Get Doro out of the rut. Let her meet a few men whose names are neither Colfax nor Oakhampton, nor any other name of the good and worthy roundabout, and we shall see things move. Doro move, at any rate, I hope. Music and hunting are all very well when you're married, as a respite, but as life objects, no. Hermione'll have her, Tony stated morosely, alluding to his own sister in much the voice in which one discusses a calamity. Then that's that, G commented. In the silence that followed, Doro's voice could be heard from the music room. She was singing a song by Hahn. Tony groaned a little. "Always that modern, no words on a tune sort of stuff," he said irascibly. "Why on earth Doro can't sing a decent ballad, a song you can follow, God knows." "Ah, but it's beautiful," G said softly. "Listen." Tony listened, wearing that expression common to the uninitiated, who have bought a good thing for vast sums, grudge the outlay, but enjoy hearing it praised, receiving thereby a faint sense of return for their expenditure. Doro sang on, and if she had sung music-hall doggerel her voice would have made it beautiful. When she stopped singing, it was as if a sense of loss were instinct. She came down the wide stairs a little later. "Hello, you two," she said. Even her speaking voice had changed. It had become much softer, and had certain charming, very personal intonations. Odd words she said somehow quite differently from any one else. She stood gazing out of the window at the spring morning, and into G's mind there came the thought, "Ah me, how lovely loveliness is!" Doro had it unquestionably and quite unmistakably. She had it in her colouring, which was deep rose, in the glowing light of her hair, which was no distinct tint, but yet gave an impression of quick warmth from its thick depths, and dominating all else, she had loveliness in her eyes, jasmine eyes, as Rex had called them not inaptly once, when, looking at them, he had seen the reflection of white light in either, like a star or jasmine flower amongst its leaves. Green eyes are often talked about, and extremely seldom seen, or they are called green and discovered to be hazel. But Doro's eyes were green, in the clear light as water pools, and in the shadow as jasmine foliage. But she no longer laughed with them, though she laughed often. G had noticed that, and deplored it, and Doro's too evident slightness as well. We must get her away, she had told herself. Suppressed temperament is the deuce and all at 21. She said now, still surveying Doro urbanely, "My dear, you are going to do a season with Hermione Lascelles." Doro turned round. "Do I want to do a season with Hermione Lascelles?" she inquired. "Enormously, as you have to anyway," G suggested. "You start to-morrow." "I am disposed of, then," Doro murmured, her eyes on Tony. "Your aunt thinks it best," he said hastily. A little to both their surprise, Doro said languidly, "Oh, very well. Perhaps it will be fun," and sauntered to the door. G said at length, "The spring, my dear Tony, its usual influence either abandon or sweet depression. Berkeley Square will be a good tonic for that, take my word for it." "I hope so," Tony said disconsolately. He had expected some slight passage at arms, which should have given him an opportunity to exert his authority, or at least suggest that he had the power to do so, and behold, quiescence had robbed him of the chance of exploiting what he knew he had not, and had therefore longed to pretend he had. Some of life's hardest moments are those when we realize that other people have long and carelessly known the weakness we believed only we ourselves suspected. He walked out when G had left, and cursed Pan in the gardens. There was, deep in his heart, a strange but not bitter jealousy of Pan. Pan had taken Doro from him as surely as if he had carried her bodily away, for Doro had never been the Doro of Tony's life after that one brief winter. She and he had discussed nothing. Sometimes, hearing from Pan, whose extravagances had been tediously recurrent through the years, that he was at Bucharest, or Biarritz, or Berlin, or any other place where gaiety and women were, he had mentioned this fact openly, but no one had ever offered any comment. Pan had had a great victory, had he known it, by making Doro love him. He had left Tony's life empty. Doro had never come back. Tony thought of it like that. Not in 3 years even. It was as if over the happy gaiety and frankness a film of frost rested. You never felt quite at ease. Tony sighed as he walked. Perhaps London would do the trick, make her forget. Lord, what was there to remember so faithfully about Pan, who had loved a dozen women since Doro, and only left her because of money? Yet it had never occurred to Tony to tell Doro the truth. Pan was his brother. They had had the same father. No, one couldn't do that. They left for town on the following day, accompanied by Emilia, Nick, and the car. Doro was to have every possible thing which made life attractive. Of course, Tony and G had taken her to town every year to do the shows. They had all stayed at the Stafford, and had not bothered to open up Greville House, but those visits had been brief and, as it were, undressed. This stay was to dedicate the French frocks and every possible adornment Doro could desire. Hermione, Ione, as she ordered herself to be called, was not, of course, at home when they arrived. Damn bad manners, both G and Tony thought. Doro did not mind. She had met Ione several times, and she neither liked nor disliked her. Tea was served, Doro and G presiding, to a host of people they knew by name only, though G knew their families in some cases. Tony knew no one and handed food. At 6 Ione arrived. She had the odd gift which some people find a charm in itself, of appearing at once bored and vital. Her health was amazing, though she adopted an air of becoming fatigue, and, clad usually in filmy, beautiful frocks, gave a clever impression of frailty. Her manners were adorable, if often rather exhausted, and her appearance all she desired it to be. Charles Lascelles adored her, and had been trained by her to do so in perpetuity. He was not clever, but she had made him interesting, and she paraded her affection for him whenever she remembered to do so. Her vivacity was inextinguishable, and she maintained a champagne standard, and was duly valued as a guest and enjoyed as a hostess. Now as she entered, some glow seemed to enter the room too. She said at once, "Darlings," in her attractive voice, and kissed everyone, laughed at everyone, declared she was dying for tea, had none, and lit a cigarette, made plans for the evening, and summed up Doro in her own mind. Spoilt, generous, self-willed, passionate, a handful, or will be. What fun! Thank God she's beautiful. They dined at 8:30, and had 10 guests to dinner, and left for a play about 10. It ended at 11:45, when everyone went on to someone's house, and drank champagne and danced. At 2, Tony took Doro back to Berkeley Square, left her there, and repaired to the Stafford, and wished he had been with G, who had returned after dinner, and thanked his Maker he was going back to Hurst Point on the morrow. Doro woke about 9, and listened to Emilia's description of her evening, described her own, and Julie went, as requested, after her bath, to Ione's room. Ione was up in a peignoir, her hair still hanging down and tied back with a ribbon. She was 43 and looked 30 andazabile. She did not dye her hair, which was very pretty and naturally wavy, but had it washed by her French hairdresser in some herbal wash, which answered just the same purpose as a dye, but was not such a bother. Quite honestly, she had no real interest in anyone save herself, and, through herself, her husband and son, but she had a sense of family feeling, and her house was so large it meant very little to her chaperoning Doro, and of course Tony was a very liberal donor. Charles, who was really nothing, was ostensibly a shipping magnate in London, and, quite truly, a good landlord in the country. Nicholas, the boy, was with Rex at Magdalen, and was innocuous, gay, good-looking, and had charming manners. The only disappointment of Ione's life had been that he had not inherited her brains. However, he had her looks and his father's, and that was something, and also he thought her the most wonderful woman in the world, and that was another. Not that Ione would have owned menfolk who did not. She insisted on nothing visibly, and obtained everything by dint of concealing her force of character whilst she exercised it. Women loved her because she talked with them, and not about them. She knew few people who were not fond of her, and attributed this, firstly to her charm, secondly to her house, thirdly to her lack of snobbishness, which was a real fact. There are only 2 sets of people in the world who are not snobs. One is the set which does not care to visit the homes of the great, or call them by their Christian names in public, because it can, and the other is composed of those irresponsible idealists who do not count anyway. One grasped by inference to which set Ione belonged. Her hospitality was indiscriminate. She did not care what guests she asked to her house for big affairs, because she rarely realized they were there. As a result, the semi-demi smart woman of the world, the woman of a certain social status and breeding, who possessed, however, a wider outlook than was customary in some matters. Women, that is to say, who managed to keep their lovers and their prestige at the same time, went there. Mothers as devoted to their children as Ione, artistic people and steady friends of Charles, and Ione's habitués, and an olla podrida of moneyed London. Ione was restlessly modern, and meant, as she said, to have a good time. G would have been nearly stunned into a decline had she realized Ione's code of life. Mercifully she believed it to be that of all Rexfords, and had therefore felt quite at ease in committing Doro to her charge. Tony knew nothing anyway, and would have realized very little if he had stayed a month at Berkeley Square. Ione surveyed Doro much as she looked over a horse at Tattersall's. Then she announced where Doro should go for clothes, where they were going during the day for amusement, and told her she was beautiful, and asked her if she wished to marry. Doro said no, composedly. "Oh, why?" Ione asked. "It's really the best way of living. Most people make such a muddle of it because they feel convinced it must have a basis of mutual adoration. As if that ever lasted, or could. Every woman ought to study science a little, sufficiently anyway, to grasp the why and wherefore of duration, of what all of us, at one time or another, call love. Look at me." She flashed a smile in Doro's direction. "I married Charles 22 years ago, and there is not one moment of my married life I regret, and yet I was never in love with him. I had a sense of values, that was all. I liked his looks, I knew him well. I realized he had certain qualities that made for peace and contentment, and he adored me. I was very fond of him. I have never liked any man as well, and so I married him. I foresaw we could make a decent thing of life. We had the same tastes. At least, I knew we should have. Charles was malleable, you see, and we loved children and having a good time, and he, as I say, loved me. Voila." "Do you believe in romance, Ione?" Doro asked. "I mean, the sort one reads about. Deathless passion, two people who matter to one another intensely." Ione shot a very shrewd glance in Doro's direction. Tony and G had told her nothing. She felt a little aggrieved, realizing there was something to tell. She said, walking about the beautiful room, putting carnations straight in their vases, tidying her letters, directing her maid at intervals, "You mean the Paolo Francesca, Romeo and Juliet love? Yes, for a woman, but for extremely rare women. Women who would use their mentality in love. Never a grande amoureuse, and unfortunately, most clever women who have great temperament exploit it in that way. To love you have to have so much free time, my dear. Freedom of thought, too, and that's so difficult to obtain. And qualities which are rather far-fetched for most of us. The spirit of sacrifice, limitless generosity, humility, oh, I don't know. All the dull virtues which are only not dull when they are guided by brilliant mentality. For the ordinary everyday man and woman, romance is an impossibility. Sorry to be depressing, but that is the truth. It's better, my dear, to go in for a good time, as we are going to do. Get dressed now, will you? The car will be round at 11. She was peacefully bored with Doro by the afternoon, and might have stayed in that condition of perfect amiability if Doro had not arranged with Cavini for a singing lesson the following day. Ione stood on the stairs spellbound. True to type, or perhaps one should say, to the standard she imposed in order to keep her position as déesse with her friends, she knew the arts intelligently. At any rate, she recognized the wonder of Doro's voice, and quite quickly, after realization, the attraction this discovery would be for her next parties. She went into the drawing-room when the song was finished, and found the great Cavini nearly weeping with joy. "What a voice!" he said to her, mopping his face. "What a voice!" He enthused wildly, speaking with Neapolitan frankness of Doro's appearance, her anatomy, and temperament. Scientifically and physiologically. Ione smiled at Doro. "How interesting!" She gave a big party the following week, and Doro sang at it, in a callow frock, with a temperament en evidence in her voice. She had a furor of a success, and through it became in a moment a definite personality. Rex, down on a visit with Nicholas Lascelles, found a new being. He told her so, leaning his long length against the window, and gazing at her dispassionately. "What do you mean to do about it?" he asked. Doro laughed. "Oh, live, have a good time, as Ione is always saying." He nodded. "Grow like Ione?" "One might do worse, my dear." "Granted, as they say in Yorkshire, or County Somerset, or Beckenham. But do you enormously admire even the very best paste? I know it's a most finished thing, far more valued by connoisseurs than solitaires, for instance. But after all, it's not the real thing." Doro laughed again. Rex was so delightfully funny and abstruse. "Poor Ione! How crushing!" "Oh, she'd laugh," Rex assured her. "She'd never accept any statement that wasn't flattering as true." Doro liked having Rex and Nicholas. Both were good looking, and both smart, with that clean niceness which is so pleasing. Both, needless to say, interested in their clothes to a degree of absorption. Nicholas proposed, quite happily, to do nothing. Rex intended to stand, he announced, somewhere, somehow, some day. His limp had nearly disappeared. He had trained, exercised, undergone an operation in order to become fit, and he had outgrown much of his earlier delicacy. Nicholas and he, Doro and Ione, raced through life. It was lived to pitched laughter, quick wit, quicker dancing, rather heavy drinking. Everyone drank and was amused by it, and if you drank too much, were more amused. Rex, writing to G, was discreet for her sake. He took a week end off his brief vacation to go down and stay with her, though he longed to remain in London. He told her of Doro's success. He dilated on her beauty, Ione's kindness, and bowdlerized his description of the crowd with which Doro and she ran. He went up for a last huge party before term began the following day. It was early May, and the train sped through cuttings tipped with shining greenness out into fields golden starred with dandelions. London seemed utterly delightful in the gay pink and gold sunset. The streets were thronged, the shops glowing lengths of colour. Ione's house had new flowers in the window boxes, marguerites and lobelias, and the awning was ready for the ball and the red carpet. He had that splendid sense of bien-être which being fit and young and happy alone conveys. He took the austere steps 2 at a time, and hailed Nicholas with a shout as he saw him going upstairs. They turned into Nicholas's special room for a cocktail. "Where's Doro?" Rex asked almost at once. "Putting the war paint on, or out, or something," Nicholas answered. "I say, Shropshire did!" Rex felt an odd contraction in his heart. He heard himself say unemotionally, "And Doro?" "Did not," young Nicholas said as solemnly. Rex burst out laughing. "It's a chance of a lifetime gone foot," Nicholas observed almost reproachfully, staring at him. "A title, places, hell of a lot of money, and a decent feller, take it all in all." "Good deal of one sort of all," Rex suggested keenly. Nicholas had a nature which in early youth admires a dog, and believes fastness to be an asset. He wagged his boyish head. "Oh, well, we only live once," he remarked. "And other people live lots of lives for us to atone for it." "Oh, well," Nicholas repeated vaguely. He could never cope with Rex when he became what he called top lofty. "What did your mater say?" Rex asked suddenly. "Oh, nothing. Laughed. Shropshire went to her first, in the good old-fashioned way. He meant business, I tell you." "Where is Doro, anyway?" "I've told you. Out or in or not or something," Nicholas suggested. "I dunno." Rex went in search of her, but in vain. They met at dinner, finally, which happened to be a party at the Ritz, and Rex found himself opposite Doro. Beside her, Lord Shropshire was sitting, visibly passing through that process vulgarly known as bearing up, and not doing so with distinction. Doro met Rex's eyes and smiled at him. Again that odd little contraction shook his heart. At least his breath caught for a second. He went on looking at Doro, and chose perversely to imagine her engaged to Shropshire. Suddenly Shropshire's hearty voice said to him, "I say, Greville, whom do you want to murder?" Rex knew he flushed darkly. He felt the hot blood drum up under his skin right to his forehead. He laughed as naturally as he could. "I bet there was someone," Shropshire pursued heavily. "Your eyes had a glare in them, old son, I tell you." Rex asked himself, "What on earth's the matter with me?" He felt ashamed of his idiocy, as he termed it, and turned resolutely to his partner and made conversation. He scarcely looked at Doro again. But when they were leaving the Ritz, she came up to him. "Let's walk back together," she whispered. "It's only a few steps, and it's such a heavenly night." She slid a hand through his arm, and in that touch he knew, for it seemed to race like a flame through his veins until it reached his heart. The flame rested there. Almost with stupefaction he told himself, "I love her." It seemed to him that he walked beside her in some dream, that he must awake and say, "How extraordinary!" It seemed so real. It was as if a spell held him in thrall. He realized the scent of the London streets in summer time. He heard the roar of the traffic. A car gleamed out of the soft darkness. Doro was speaking, and mechanically, over and over again, his own soul seemed to say, "I love her, I love her." Now, as she moved, as her hand pressed less lightly, that amazing thrill pierced its way to him again. He had never, as an actual fact, as a thing that must happen to him, thought of love. His life had had no place for it, no time. Even lately at Oxford, he had never been absorbed by the one topic which seemed to interest most of the men. There had been Doro and G in his life. They had sufficed him. He did not realize, and would not, for some long time, how much G's influence had swayed him, how very much she had counted, and how wholly finely in his life. Tonight all the world seemed a new place, miraculous yet disturbing, greatly perplexing. "You're very silent," Doro said to him, "and we're nearly there. I wanted to hear about home." Rex dashed into a jerky, spirited description of his visit, and all the while, as he held her arm in closely, he longed to cry out, "Don't take your hand away. I love it there," and wondered with a sort of chill, almost frightened wonder, what Doro would say if he did so. He was uncertain what he felt, save this heady, stinging sensation of mystifying delight. He was out of his depth utterly. He glanced at Doro's profile shyly, bending his head to see it better. It was as though he had never seen her until now. He thought of his stay at Pointers, and his restless longing to be back in London. He had wondered why a little himself. It had been all the while as if some power had been drawing and drawing him back. He remembered walking in G's garden very late, and standing beside the tobacco plants and feeling the strangest sense of stirredness. But he had not actually thought of Doro then. It had only been when he had imagined her in love with Shropshire that he had truly realized. He had known then that for her to love another man would be hideous, simply that it could not be. At that moment it did not seem to him that love could be unreturned. Because it had been born in his heart, it must be born too in the heart of the woman who had inspired it. Life's most delicate and poignant irony, the belief that love must create love, was accepted by him as a lovely and immutable gospel. Partly perhaps because he had been ill so much, and therefore had been debarred from leading the ordinary boy's happily dull career, the strain of mysticism in his nature had become a strong influence. He brought to love much that few youths of his years could bring, and one quality which few people ever practice or can with regard to love, the exercise of philosophy. He had read so much, dreamed so much, been, save for G's love, his love for her, in itself a strangely gentle, strangely curious influence, so alone, that his outlook was bound to be either misanthropic or that of a visionary disciple of whatever creed aroused his loyalty. His unspoiltness and straightness, and, until a short time before, pathetic disability for sport, had made it the latter. He was clean all through by instinct, and because of G's robust clarity. If he was pedantic, he was also gallant. That wild desire to tell Doro, to urge what seemed to blaze in his brain and heart, to speak of his love, seized him again. "Doro," he said, and thought his voice normal. Doro, loosing his arm, said, "Did you speak, Rex?" The crushing snub, which mere normality administers more effectively than irony or indifference, because it is unconscious, struck him to silence. She was on the red carpeted steps, he mounting behind her. The moment had passed. Ione was already at the entrance of the ballroom, looking a little bored and quite beautiful, and wearing what Nicholas disrespectfully described as the eternal fender. Some people had arrived, and the band was playing. Rex, with quick foresight, claimed certain dances with Doro. Later, much later, she was to sing. Recamez was to appear also, and Cavini was to play. "Now we're off," Nicholas exclaimed, listening to this description of fame and beauty. Ione danced with him. She loved him as she loved nothing and no one else. For her, he was never this big person, but her little son, whose advent had been the greatest joy of her life. He danced perfectly, and so did she, and she looked like his sister. "Mauve, you're a beauty and a peach," he told her. "And you're a darling, baby," she answered, laughing at him, her brilliant eyes soft and shining with pleasure. Rex, dancing with Doro, felt his dream thrall upon him, and with it that startlingly keen perception dreams seem to confer. It was as if he really saw Doro for the first time, and he gloried in this flooding vision. His thoughts ran goldenly. Every poem he had ever read of love, of lovely women, seemed to float through his brain. He invested Doro with the glamour of a first great romance, and could look this night upon her rose carnation colouring, her lovely petalled mouth, with the worship of one before an altar. He and she seemed both unreal in this white hour of revelation. Yet once, as they danced, and Doro moved her head and her hair brushed his bent cheek, a thrill so exultant, so virile, shook him that unconsciously his arm tightened round her, his hand holding hers trembled. Oh, did she not feel too? She must, she should. He relinquished her with his heart drumming like a rebel against all serenity, and his young blood like wine. He could not dance with anyone else yet. He slipped out onto the balcony. London glowed and shivered with intensity of life around him. He felt a passionate oneness with it, with all the glitter and stress, the golden lights below, the silver above, and between, the swimming blueness of a perfect night. Down in the street a man laughed. A girl's voice answered his laugh. The lilac trees waved their fragrant tassels and wafted the scent into the soft air. A laburnum gleamed like palely golden fire. All Rex's youth flamed in him too, like a mounting torch which would blaze into sudden dazzling splendour. I live, he told himself, with a little excited boyish laugh. Suddenly he longed to be in G's garden beside the tobacco plant again, its intoxicating and poignant perfume charming him like a caress, to stand there with Doro and kiss her, and kiss her. He realized that the dance music had ceased and went back. Everyone was moving slowly towards the music room. Doro was to sing, or Recamez, at any rate, he longed to hear. He saw Doro standing beside Ione, and Cavini waving his hands absurdly and smiling fatuously. Everyone grew very still. Cavini ceased attitudinizing and seated himself at the piano, and the first notes of L'Heure Exquise fell like flower petals into the silence. That sheer ecstasy, which can only come from knowledge as well as appreciation, filled Rex. Each tone of Doro's voice was like the music of his own spirit. The song ended, and there was that moment's supreme tribute of utter noiselessness before the applause broke out. Rex, as it died away, when it was seen that Cavini was preparing to play again, heard a voice behind him, and recognized, with that irritating uncertainty which nags at the mind, that he could not place its owner, and unwillingly turned his head. His eyes met Pasquale Greville's dark golden ones. "Ah, Rex." The two nodded coldly. Rex turned away again. But he had lost his hold on utter delight, and though his music-loving soul paid its just tribute, yet his mind was absorbed by Greville's arrival. And instantly, as partner to his disturbed absorption, came another thought. What would Doro feel? He looked at her, and by a most unhappy chance saw in her eyes her greeting to Pan. His soul sickened with an unknown fear and dread as he watched Doro's face, for it was exactly as though a light were lit behind those lovely eyes, as if one gazed oneself on earth upon the entry of another into paradise. Her face was illumined, transfigured for a second, then convention reasserted its sway, and she smiled formally at Pan. And he, with a violent twist of his shoulders, Rex stared at him again. Ah, he had seen too. He had been of even colour when first they had recognized one another. Now, after that instant's exchange of glances with Doro, his face was white. Rex studied him with the merciless scrutiny of youth for disliked age. He looked older, his thick hair had a powdering on the temples, innumerable tiny lines showed round his mouth, but he was still damnably good-looking, and Rex hated him for the fact, as well as for forcing it on his recognition. But he looked lived out, and Rex recognized it. He pushed a courteous way to Pan. "When did you get back?" he asked civilly. "This afternoon. From Paris, from Petersburg, from Peking." "Rather interesting tour. I suppose you made it because of the alliteration. Staying in town long?" "Haven't an idea." "Where are you putting up?" "I'm at the Ritz. You must dine one night." "Thanks. I go up to-morrow, though. I'm with Nicholas Lascelles at Magdalen." "Ah, dim shades of my youth." "Oh, really?" They had no more to say. They eyed one another with hidden hostility. Pan said perfunctorily, "And Hurst Point, and so on?" "Quite all right, I think. I was there for 2 weekends. My father and G were fit." The use of that possessive pronoun irritated Pan obscurely. Supercilious, affected young cub. He said in a slight drawl, "Doro seems to have come on, what?" and without waiting for Rex's answer, strolled through an opening he saw and walked towards the piano. Rex watched the actual meeting with miserable weakness, aware he only did so because of his suspicion, and despising himself, and yet unable to leave the coign of vantage. And again he saw Doro's face illumined for a moment. Then, bewilderingly, it changed utterly, and became ironically cold. He turned away and went into the other room, an anguish of half-understood bitterness welling up in him. End of chapter 14. Recording by Maricel Cui.